Welcome back to A Scientist Among Us, and you're watching another episode of Hypotheses on Obesity. And in this episode, I wanted to look at the gut microbiota. So within your stomach and your intestine, there's a large population of microorganisms and bacteria, and these supposedly aid in nutrient absorption and just in overall gut health. And they may have an effect on obesity as well. The first piece of evidence that we have for suggesting this is to look at antibiotics used in farm animals. In 1910, the US had a food shortage, and as a result, the USDA started looking at ways to stabilize the food supply. And one discovery that really helped do this was the use of antibiotics as growth promoters in poultry animals. And what they found was that if you fed farm animals antibiotics, then they grew fatter and bigger, and you can get more meat from one animal. Now, that's kind of interesting from a gut microbiota perspective, because if you feed antibiotics to the animals, what you're essentially doing is wiping out their gut microbiota. So if you feed an animal antibiotics and wipe out their gut microbiota, they seem to gain weight and become obese. While if the gut microbiota is present, they remain healthy and they maintain their weight. So this was kind of the first suggestion that the gut microbiota might have some effect on obesity. The effect that was seen in farm animals of antibiotics raising their weights was also explored in mice in this paper that I found in Nature. And what the authors saw was kind of striking. So when they looked at the weight of the animals that were treated with antibiotics when they were in their infancy, they found that the weight didn't really change all that much. And you can see in that graph that the weight doesn't really change between controls and animals treated with different antibiotics. However, when they looked at fat mass, the animals that were treated in their infancy with antibiotics, they had a very much greater amount of total fat, and their percentage of fat in their body was also increased, whereas the percentage of lean mass was slightly decreased. Now, the authors did a whole series of other studies, and one of those was to look at the gut microbiota. And what they did was they used methods like 16S ribosome sampling to look at how many bacteria were actually in the gut microbiome of these mouse. And what they ended up finding was that the overall number didn't really change, but the composition of the gut microbiota did change. And this is reflected in a ratio called the Bacteroidetes Firmicutes ratio. So these are two different families of bacteria. Bacteroidetes is one family, and Firmicutes is another family. And as you can see in this graph, when the mice were not treated with antibiotics, there was a higher amount of Bacteroidetes as compared to Firmicutes. Whereas when they were treated with antibiotics, that changed. This ratio went all the way down, and it was more of an equal ratio. And perhaps there was even more Firmicutes than there was Bacteroidetes. And there are significant changes in the gut microbiota. And to correlate fat gain with a change in the gut microbiota suggests that there is some sort of influence of the gut microbiota in obesity. So we saw that there was an effect in mice of using antibiotics in their infancy, and the question then comes, is this effect observed in humans as well? It turns out there's actually a JAMA study, a clinical association study, where they looked at the association between risk of childhood obesity and antibiotic use in infancy. And before I present the data from that study, I want to go over the concept of rate ratio. So we're going to use this resource from Boston University to try and explain the concept of rate ratios. So we have this table over here, and in the first column of the table, you're looking at whether the patients used hormones after menopause. So there's a yes column and a no column. The column to the far right, that's person years of disease-free follow-up, you can consider that sort of like your total sample size. So that's like the total number of patients within each group that you're comparing. And in the middle column, you're looking at the condition that you're trying to associate with postmenopausal hormone use, which is coronary artery disease. So, to calculate a rate ratio, we first need to calculate incidence rates of coronary artery disease for each of these populations that either used hormones after menopause or did not use hormones after menopause. So, the incidence rate of coronary artery disease for those who use hormones after menopause is 30 divided by 54,308.7. And that's basically kind of like an incident, that's the rate of the disease occurring within that population. So that you can take that ratio. You could do the exact same thing for the population who didn't use hormones after menopause, and that's 60 divided by 51,477.5. And now we have two rates. So if you divide the rate of those who were using hormones divided by the control who weren't using hormones, then you get the rate ratio. So basically, if the rate of coronary artery disease in those who did use hormones after menopause was 55.2 per 100,000 person years, and the rate for those who didn't use hormones was 116.6 per 100,000 person years. And if you take 55.2, which is the rate for those who were using hormones, divided by 116.6, which is the rate for those who weren't using hormones, you get a rate ratio of 0.47. And what this basically tells you is for those who were using hormones after menopause, they had a 0.47 times the rate of coronary artery disease as compared to those who did not. So what this tells you is that coronary artery disease occurs less than half as much for those who were using the hormones than for those who didn't. So there might be a protective effect of hormone use for coronary artery disease. All right, with that concept, we're now going to go look at the JAMA article to see what is the rate ratio for obesity risk in populations that were using antibiotics in infancy and populations that did not use antibiotics in infancy. So this study looked at infants who were treated with antibiotics very, very young, and they were looking at infants that were treated with narrow spectrum antibiotics, which only kill certain bacterial species, broad spectrum antibiotics, which kill many, if not all, bacterial species, and they were looking at the statistics for both groups combined as compared to controls where the control population was not treated in infancy with antibiotics. And what you generally find is that the rate ratio increases for the population that was treated with broad spectrum antibiotics in infancy. And this is almost greater than 1.1. So the population that were treated with broad spectrum antibiotics 4 times during their infancy are greater than 1.1 times as likely than those who weren't treated with antibiotics at all to develop obesity. Now, 1.1 times may not seem like a very large number, but if you consider that this study has a really, really large sample size, it really is a large number of kids who ended up with childhood obesity later in life when they went into their childhood, from infancy to childhood. And really that suggests that there is some sort of correlation between obesity and antibiotic use in infancy. So between these 3 studies, looking at farm animals, looking at rats, and looking at humans, there seems to be a correlation between all 3 studies, and they seem to be related, and they seem to be saying the same thing, which is that the gut microbiota matters for obesity. And I kind of wanted this to be an introductory video because tomorrow I'm actually going to get to interview somebody with a lot more experience than me, and he's going to give a way better explanation of this whole thing, and we can go look at the mechanisms of how the gut microbiota actually causes obesity or doesn't cause obesity or prevents obesity or whatever the gut microbiota is doing. But in this video, I think, at least looking through the literature, we've established for ourselves that the presence of the gut microbiota is important for preventing obesity. So if you wipe out your gut microbiota and you don't have any bacteria in your gut or your intestines, there's a good chance that you will develop obesity, and you'll be 1.1 times as much likely if you were treated in infancy, according to that JAMA article. If you enjoyed this content, like and subscribe, hit the bell. It helps me out. I really like talking about this. I really like learning about new subjects and navigating my own way through it. And whatever I find out, I try to tell all of you so that you can join me on the journey and learn with me. And this has been A Scientist Among Us. Don't forget to breathe.